When Clara Whitfield missed her train, she thought she was just throwing away a lie. The lie was her only chance at a life. A respectable life as a mail-order bride in California, married to a man who thought she was someone she wasn't. But on a dusty Wyoming train platform in 1879, under a sun that baked the world bone dry, she chose to help a dying stranger instead. A frail old man clutching his chest, his face as white as bleached linen. She had no idea that old man owned half of Wyoming. Gold mines that slept under lonely mountains. Cattle ranches so vast they drank from a dozen rivers. And she had no idea that his secret fortune was about to attract the kind of trouble that doesn't leave witnesses. Steam roared from the black iron locomotive, a monster getting ready to breathe fire and race across the prairie. Clara Whitfield pressed her sweaty palm against the train ticket. That little piece of paper was a bridge from the miserable life she knew to a future she could only imagine. The Wyoming territory stretched out forever, golden and empty under the August sun. Dust devils spun across the plains like little ghosts. Her stomach was a knot of fear and hope. She clutched the worn leather bag that held her one good dress and all her earthly possessions. The train's whistle screamed, a sound so loud it felt like it was inside her skull. Around her, the wooden platform was chaos. Travelers pushed and shoved, desperate to climb aboard the great machine that promised a new beginning in California. Clara had never been more than 20 miles from the town she was born in. Now she was about to cross hundreds of miles of wilderness to marry a man she'd only seen in a faded photograph. Her fingers found the cold, dead weight of her father's pocket watch in her bag. It was the only thing she had left of him, besides the mountain of debts that had forced her onto this train. The watch hadn't ticked in years, but holding it made her feel a little less alone. It reminded her of a time when their small house felt safe, before the sickness took Papa and the creditors started circling like wolves. "All aboard for California!" the conductor's voice boomed, cutting through the hiss of steam and the clang of steel. Clara took a shaky breath. She took one step toward the train. Mr. Henry Calloway was waiting in Sacramento. He was expecting a refined, educated woman. She'd made sure her letters sounded that way, painstakingly copying phrases from books she could barely understand. The truth was, she'd spent her life on her knees, scrubbing other people's floors, her hands raw and chapped. But in California, maybe she could become the woman from the letters. Maybe the lie could become the truth. The steps to the train car looked as tall as a cliff. Other passengers scurried up, easy as you please. But Clara's legs felt like they were made of water. What if Mr. Calloway saw her hands and knew instantly? What if he asked her to read something more complicated than a shop sign? Just as she reached for the cold metal handrail, a voice cut through the noise. It was weak, desperate. "Help! Please, help me!" Clara turned. What she saw made her heart stop dead in her chest. An old man, with a kind face and a shock of silver hair, had collapsed against a wooden shipping crate. His face was a deathly white, and one hand was pressed tight against his chest. His other hand was reaching for a walking stick that had rolled just out of his grasp. People just walked right past him. They didn't even seem to see him. A woman in a fancy purple dress, her nose in the air, carefully stepped over his outstretched legs. A man in a sharp black suit hurried by, his eyes glued to a handful of money. The old man was invisible. A piece of trash to be ignored. He was gasping for air, his gray eyes wide with panic. The train whistle screamed again, a long final warning. The conductor was slamming doors shut. In a few seconds, her only chance, her entire future, would be gone. It would disappear in a cloud of smoke and steam. But she couldn't turn away from those scared, lonely eyes. They reminded her of her father in his last moments. Clara dropped her bag. She didn't even feel it hit the platform. She ran to the old man faster than she'd ever moved in her life. Her train ticket, the precious bridge to her new life, fluttered from her hand and landed in the dirt like a wounded butterfly. She didn't care. She knelt beside him in the grime, her one good dress soaking up the dust. The man was fighting for every breath, making a terrible rasping sound. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Tell me how to help you." "My medicine bag," he whispered. His voice was barely a puff of air. He pointed with a shaky finger toward a small leather pouch that had fallen open. Tiny glass bottles had scattered everywhere. rolling in the dust and horse droppings. His heart was seizing up. Clara knew the signs. She'd seen it happen to her papa, that awful moment when the heart forgets its rhythm, and a man drowns on dry land. Behind her, she heard the groan of metal on metal. The train was moving. Which bottle? Her hands flew across the dirty platform, scooping up the little vials. Her mind was screaming. The train was leaving. Her life was leaving. The old man's breathing got shallower. Blue one? Small blue one. His voice was fading. Her fingers scrambled through the collection of bottles. There. A small one, filled with a dark blue liquid. The cork was jammed in tight. She twisted with all her might, her knuckles white. It popped free with a soft thump. The smell was sharp, bitter, like all-powerful medicine. Here, drink this. She gently lifted his head and tipped the bottle to his lips. The train's whistle gave one last, mournful cry as it pulled away from the station, gathering speed. From the corner of her eye, Clara watched her future chug away down the tracks. Her carefully constructed lie, her hope for a new beginning, all of it vanished into the shimmering heat of the prairie. The ticket was gone. Mr. Calloway was gone. Everything was gone. She was alone in a strange town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dead pocket watch. But as she watched the last train car disappear, something miraculous happened. The color started to return to the old man's face. His breathing deepened, losing its ragged edge. The terrible whiteness around his lips faded. After a few minutes, he managed to sit up, leaning heavily against the crate. He looked at the empty tracks, and his kind gray eyes filled with a deep worry. "Child, your train." Clara forced a smile, though her heart felt like a cold stone in her chest. "Trains come and go," she said. She didn't mention she had no money for another ticket. No place to sleep. No way to even send a message to the man who was expecting her. "Are you feeling better now?" "Much better. Thanks to you." The old man slowly got to his feet, using his walking stick for support. He was dressed in patched, worn clothes, but they were clean. He carried himself with a quiet dignity. "My name's Josiah Brennan," he said. "I've been wandering these territories for more years than I care to remember." Clara helped steady him. "I'm Clara Whitfield. Well, I guess I was heading somewhere that doesn't matter anymore." Josiah studied her face, his gaze deep and knowing. "Everything matters, child," he said softly. "Especially the things that don't happen the way we planned." He had no idea how right he was, and she had no idea that the man she had just saved was about to drag her into a conflict that could get them both killed. The fire crackled, a small island of light in the vast darkness behind the Cheyenne livery stable. Josiah Brennan stirred a dented pot of beans. His hands, though weathered and old, were surprisingly steady now. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the faint sound of a piano from a distant saloon. "You saved my life today," Josiah said, his voice quiet. He ladled a helping of beans onto a chipped tin plate and handed it to her. "Most folks would have just stepped right over me to catch their train." Clara's stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since sunrise. "My mama always said helping others comes back to you threefold." She sighed, poking at the beans with a bent spoon. "Of course, she also said good things come to those who wait, and I've been waiting 23 years for something good to happen." Josiah's gray eyes twinkled in the firelight. "What were you hoping to find in California, child?" Clara felt a flush of shame. "A husband. A man named Henry Calloway. I answered his advertisement for a mail-order bride." She stared into the fire, the truth tasting like ash in her mouth. "I sent him a photograph. I wrote him letters telling him I was educated and refined." She looked at Josiah. "The truth is, I can barely read more than a few words, and the only thing refined about me is how good I am at scrubbing floors." Josiah let out a low chuckle. It was a warm, kind sound that made the loneliness in her chest ache a little less. "Seems to me you're plenty refined right where it counts. In your heart." "Hearts don't pay the rent, Mr. Brennan," she said bitterly. I owe 3 months on a room I can't afford. I have no way to get to California. No money for another ticket. She set her plate down, her appetite gone. I'm right back where I started. Nowhere to go and nobody to turn to. The old man's face grew serious in the flickering light. His eyes seemed to hold ancient secrets. What if I told you, he said slowly, that there might be another way, a way that doesn't involve pretending to be somebody you're not? Before Clara could ask what he meant, a sound from the darkness made them both freeze. The rhythmic beat of horse hooves. Getting closer. 3 riders emerged from the shadows. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold. The man in the lead wore a sheriff's badge that glinted wickedly in the firelight. His smile was thin and cruel. Well, well, the sheriff drawled, swinging down from his horse with a lazy arrogance. If it isn't old Josiah Brennan, camping out like a common vagrant. His eyes swept over to Clara, and his gaze lingered in a way that made her skin crawl. And with such lovely company. Josiah had gone stiff as a board beside her. Evening, Sheriff Drummond. We're not causing any trouble. Trouble has a way of finding you, Brennan, Drummond sneered. His 2 deputies stayed on their horses, their hands resting casually near their holstered pistols. It's been a long time since you dared to show your face in my territory. Clara could feel the history between these 2 men. It was a dangerous, poisoned history, thick as mud. We'll be moving on in the morning, Josiah said, his voice tight. Sheriff Drummond laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Move on where? You've got no horse, no wagon, no money. He took a step closer to the fire, his shadow looming over them. Face it, old man. Your wandering days are over. It's time to settle your debts. Clara found her voice, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. What does he owe? The sheriff's smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. Why don't you ask your friend here about his mining claims, sweetheart? His voice dripped with false concern. Ask him about all the good people who trusted him with their life savings. Ask him where all their money went before it disappeared like smoke up a chimney. Drummond leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. And while you're at it, ask him what happened to his partner, the one who ended up dead at the bottom of a ravine 30 years ago. Dawn broke over Cheyenne, painting the sky in shades of pale gold and pink. The air was cool and crisp. Clara walked beside Josiah through the dusty main street. The old man moved with a new sense of purpose, his cane tapping a firm, steady rhythm on the boardwalk. Clara hadn't slept. The sheriff's words had circled in her mind all night. Murder. Stolen money. Was this kind old man really a thief? A killer? They stopped in front of the most impressive building in town. A 2-story brick structure with large glass windows. The First National Bank. Tell me the truth, Mr. Brennan, Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. What did Sheriff Drummond mean? About a dead partner? Josiah didn't look at her. He stared at the brass nameplate beside the bank's heavy door, his fingers tracing the letters. A storm of emotions passed over his weathered face. Grief, regret, and something else she couldn't name. 30 years ago, he began, his voice raspy. I was the richest man in this part of the Wyoming Territory. My partner, Silas Croft, and I, we found gold up in the mountains. More than we ever dreamed. He took a deep breath. I owned mines, cattle ranches that stretched from here to the Montana border. I had more land than a man has a right to. Clara stared at him, trying to picture this shabby old man as a land baron. The man who'd shared his last few beans with her had once been a king. What happened? My wife, Margaret, she took sick. The consumption. The doctors all said there was no hope, but I refused to listen. His voice cracked. I spent everything. I sold my share of the mines, the ranches, everything, to fund a search for a cure. I brought specialists from back east. I sent her to fancy sanitariums in Denver and San Francisco. His shoulders sagged. When she died anyway, I had nothing left. Just a heart full of guilt and a fistful of worthless deeds to the land itself. Land nobody wanted back then. But the land is still yours, isn't it? Clara pressed. Legally, yes. But Silas, he managed the investments. After Margaret died, I couldn't face it. I couldn't face him. I just walked away. I've been wandering ever since, living like a beggar." He shook his head, a look of profound regret on his face. "I left Silas to deal with the fallout. The angry investors Drummond mentioned, they were real, and they lost everything." Clara felt the pieces clicking into place. "And Silas? Your partner?" Josiah's eyes grew dark. "One day he went up into the mountains to check on a claim. There was a rock slide. He never came back. Drummond, who was just a deputy then, he spread a rumor that I'd taken the last of the money and run. That maybe I'd even had something to do with the accident." A horrible realization dawned on her. "That's why Sheriff Drummond wants you gone. If you come back and claim your land, you threaten his whole story, his whole power." Just as she said it, a sharp crack echoed through the morning air. The front window of the bank exploded, showering the boardwalk with glittering shards of glass. Clara screamed and instinctively threw herself at Josiah, pushing him behind a thick wooden post as glass rained down around them. When the dust settled, she peered out. Sheriff Drummond stood in the middle of the street. A smoking pistol was in his hand. Behind him, a crowd of hard-faced men on horseback had gathered, their hands on their guns. They looked more like a lynch mob than a posse. "Time's up, Brennan!" Drummond's voice boomed, bouncing off the buildings. "You've got two choices. Sign these papers, transferring your worthless claims over to the territorial government, or we'll dig two graves right here in the street." Townspeople appeared in doorways and peeked from behind curtains, their faces pale with fear. No one moved to help. Clara felt Josiah trembling beside her. She couldn't tell if it was from fear or from a rage that had been buried for 30 years. "He can't do this," she whispered, horrified. "It's broad daylight. There are witnesses." "He is the law in this town," Josiah replied, his voice filled with bitter defeat. "For years, he's been buying up what he thinks are abandoned claims for pennies on the dollar, then selling them to rich investors back east. My return, my very existence, proves he's a fraud. He'll do anything to shut me up." Clara's mind raced. Somewhere out there was land that belonged to this man, maybe even gold. And Sheriff Drummond was willing to commit murder in the middle of Main Street to get it. But Josiah looked broken. The fight had gone out of him decades ago. If he didn't stand up for himself, they would both die here. She had to do something. She had to reach the man he used to be. "What would Margaret want you to do, Josiah?" she asked, her voice sharp and clear. Josiah's head snapped around to look at her. His gray eyes widened in surprise. For the first time, she saw a flicker of the old fire, a spark of the man who had once ruled this territory. "She'd want me to stop running," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it was filled with a new strength. "Then let's stop running," Clara said. Her heart pounded like a drum, but her resolve was like steel. She stood up and stepped out from behind the post, directly into Sheriff Drummond's line of sight. She raised her empty hands to show she was unarmed, but she lifted her chin in defiance. "You want those papers signed so badly, Sheriff?" she called out, her voice ringing clear across the silent street. "Then let's do this properly, legally. Inside the bank with witnesses and official stamps. Let's make sure everything is done by the book." Drummond's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a broken old man and a scared little girl. Not this. Not a challenge to his authority in front of the whole town. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Killing an old vagrant was one thing. Gunning down an unarmed woman who was demanding they follow the law, that was something else entirely. Josiah moved to stand beside her. He stood taller than she'd ever seen him, his shoulders back, his eyes fixed on the man who had stolen his life. Whatever happened next, they were in it together. The sheriff had made his move. Now it was their turn. And Clara had a feeling this fight was far from over. Thunder rumbled in the distance as if the sky itself was angry. Rain began to fall, turning the dust of Main Street into a slick brown mud. Inside the bank, the air was thick with tension. It felt like a tomb. Clara stood by the wall, feeling small and out of place among the marble floors and polished wood. At a long, dark table sat Josiah. Across from him were Sheriff Drummond and two other men in expensive suits. They looked like vultures ready to pick a carcass clean. One of them, a man with a thick gold watch chain, tapped his fingers impatiently on the table. "These are deeds and claims, Mr. Brennan," the man with the watch chain said, his voice dripping with condescension. He pushed a stack of papers toward Josiah. "They are 30 years old. They are worthless. The land has been declared abandoned." "Age doesn't make a legal document worthless, Mr. Patterson," Josiah said. His voice was calm, but Clara could see a dangerous light in his eyes. The fire she had seen outside was growing. Only lies can do that. "The law is clear," Drummond interrupted, his voice a low growl. "Property left untended for that long reverts to the territory. It's forfeit." "Show me that law, Sheriff," Josiah challenged, his voice quiet but firm as granite. "Show me the statute, the specific territorial ordinance." Drummond's face flushed red. He looked at Patterson, who began shuffling nervously through a different stack of papers. "Well, it's a matter of precedent, common practice." "There is no such law," a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. A woman stood there, shaking the rain from her traveling coat. She was tall, with mud on her boots, and an iron will in her dark eyes. She carried a heavy leather satchel, which she set on the table with a solid thud that echoed in the silent room. "And who in the hell are you?" Drummond demanded, jumping to his feet. The woman fixed him with a stare that could have frozen water. "I am Judge Margaret Stone, from the Territorial Court in Laramie City." Clara's jaw dropped. A judge. A woman judge. Here. "Judge Stone," Josiah said, standing slowly. A look of stunned recognition and profound respect was on his face. "I thought you were still practicing law back in Boston." "I was," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips as she looked at Josiah, "until I received a telegram that an old friend, a man I thought was long dead, was in desperate need of help." She had named herself after his wife. They were family, or as good as. Her smile vanished as she turned her icy gaze back to the men at the table. "Gentlemen, I have spent the last 2 days reviewing the territorial archives. Mr. Brennan's claims are not just valid, they are ironclad. He never sold the land. He never legally abandoned it. According to these records, he owns more land in this territory than anyone except the Union Pacific Railroad. Patterson, the man with the gold watch, went as white as a sheet. But Sheriff Drummond assured us the titles were clear. We've invested a significant amount of capital." "Sheriff Drummond," Judge Stone said, her voice sharp as a razor, "lied to you." She opened her satchel and began pulling out document after document, laying them on the table. Rolled maps, deeds with wax seals, geological surveys. "These mining claims in the Black Hills alone are worth more than this entire town. The timber rights could build the city of Denver twice over, and the grazing land, well, it could support a cattle herd that would feed the entire United States Army." Clara felt dizzy. She hadn't just saved a poor old man. She'd saved an emperor who had forgotten he had an empire. She looked at Josiah. He wasn't looking at the papers or the maps. He was looking at her with gratitude that was worth more than all the gold in the world. "This is impossible," Drummond sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead. "He's a vagrant, a broken-down old fool with no money and no home." "He has something better than money," Clara heard herself say. All the powerful men in the room turned to stare at the girl in the dusty dress. "He has honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. Judge Stone smiled, a real warm smile. "A very smart girl, and honor is precisely what has been missing from this room." Patterson shot up from his chair, grabbing his hat. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I have urgent business back in Denver." "Sit down, Mr. Patterson," Judge Stone commanded, and her voice was no longer sweet. It was the voice of the law. "You have knowingly conspired to purchase stolen property. We have much to discuss." Drummond, seeing his scheme collapsing around him, made a desperate move for the door. But two large men in simple clothes, who Clara hadn't even noticed standing by the entrance, suddenly stepped forward to block his path. On their chests were the glinting badges of U.S. Marshals. "Going somewhere, Sheriff?" Judge Stone asked sweetly. "You can't prove anything," Drummond snarled, but his voice was shaking. His bravado was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a cornered animal. "Oh, I think I can," Josiah said, his voice calm and steady. He reached into his own worn leather folder and pulled out a thin sheaf of papers. "I can prove everything, including the letters you wrote to Mr. Patterson and his investors, promising them land that you knew, for a fact, was not yours to sell." He slid the letters across the table. They were copies, painstakingly made over the years by a friend in the telegraph office who had always suspected Drummond was a crook. The color drained from Drummond's face. It was over. He was ruined. Clara watched him crumble. For a single, fleeting moment she almost felt pity for him. Almost. "What happens now?" she whispered to Josiah. Judge Stone looked from Josiah to Clara, and then to the terrified men at the table. "Now," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "we begin to make things right. We talk about justice. We talk about restitution. And we decide what it truly means to be rich in a place like Wyoming." Outside, the storm broke. The rain came down in sheets, washing the mud from the streets of Cheyenne. It felt like a cleansing, a new beginning. But Clara had a sinking feeling that Sheriff Drummond wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully. He was a snake, and even a cornered snake has one last, desperate bite. For 6 weeks, the mountains became their world. 6 weeks of back-breaking work that turned Clara's hands from soft to calloused leather. But she'd never felt so alive. The crisp, clean air of the high country filled her lungs with every swing of the pickaxe, every heave of the shovel. They had come to Devil's Creek, to a small hidden cabin Josiah had built with his own hands 30 years before, a place he hadn't seen since the year his wife died. They worked from sunrise to sunset, sifting through the icy water of the creek, running dirt and gravel through a wooden sluice box. They were searching for proof. Not just for the courts, but for Josiah. Proof that his past wasn't just a ghost story. Then, one morning in early September, it happened. "Strike!" Josiah's voice, sharp and electric, echoed off the canyon walls. Clara dropped her tools and scrambled over the wet rocks to where he knelt. There, in the final riffle of the sluice box, nestled amongst the black sand and worthless pebbles, was a lump of metal that seemed to burn with its own internal light. It was a gold nugget the size of a chicken's egg. It caught the morning sun and threw it back in a blaze of captured fire. "Sweet mercy," Clara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, solid and real. "Mr. Brennan, this changes everything." But when she looked up, Josiah's weathered face was tight with worry, not joy. His gray eyes weren't on the gold. They were scanning the dense tree line on the ridge high above their camp. "It changes things, all right," he said, his voice low and grim. "Question is, for better or worse." Clara followed his gaze. Her blood ran cold. 3 riders sat on horseback at the top of the ridge, perfectly still, watching them, silhouettes against the bright morning sky. Even from that distance, she recognized the shape of Sheriff Drummond's hat. He hadn't been arrested. He'd been released, pending a trial. And he'd come for his revenge. "How long have they been there?" she asked, her voice a tight whisper. "Since before sunrise," Josiah said, his eyes never leaving the figures on the ridge. "They know, Clara. I don't know how, but they know we struck it rich." Her mind raced. For weeks they had been so careful. They had traveled at night. They had seen no one. But they had been watched, hunted. "We can hide the gold," she said, her voice desperate. "Bury it. They'll never find it." "It won't matter," Josiah said, his voice heavy with a 30-year-old regret. "He's not just here for the gold. He's here to silence us, to erase the past. He'll tear this whole mountainside apart to find it, and he'll use any excuse he can to put us both in the ground." He was right. Drummond couldn't afford for Josiah to testify. He couldn't afford for Clara to testify. With them gone, it was just his word against a pile of old papers. Clara stared at the heavy gold nugget in her palm. Just moments ago, it had felt like their salvation, a final victory. Now it felt like a tombstone. She thought of the lie she'd been ready to live in California, the woman she'd pretended to be. She wasn't that person anymore. The mountains, the hard work, Josiah's quiet strength. They had forged her into someone new, someone stronger. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly, "remember what you told me about Margaret? How she always said a person's real worth isn't measured in gold?" The old man's eyes softened at the mention of his wife's name. "I remember, child. Every single day." "Then maybe it's time we showed Sheriff Drummond what we're really made of." As if her words were a signal, a new sound filled the canyon. The thunder of hoofbeats. But these horses weren't coming from the ridge above. They were coming from the trail below, from the direction of town, and it sounded like a whole army was on the move. Clara and Josiah exchanged a wide-eyed glance. Were these Drummond's reinforcements, coming to trap them in a pincer? Or was it help? Had Judge Stone sent the marshals? The thundering grew louder, closer. Dust clouds billowed up from the trail. Clara gripped the heavy gold nugget in her hand, her knuckles white. The next few moments would decide everything, whether they lived as free people or died right here on Devil's Creek. The riders from the ridge were starting to move, making their way down a steep, treacherous game trail. Drummond and his men were coming. The trap was closing. Dust rose like a brown storm as 20 horses charged up the narrow trail toward their camp. Clara and Josiah stood their ground, side by side, a strange calm settling over them. They had nothing left to run from. "Whatever happens," Josiah said, his voice as steady as the mountain itself, "I want you to know, Clara, that meeting you, it was the greatest treasure I ever found." The riders from below burst into the clearing first, and Clara gasped. It wasn't Drummond. It wasn't the marshals. Leading the charge was Mayor Henderson from Cheyenne, and behind him were miners with dirt-stained faces, ranchers in worn leather chaps, and shopkeepers she recognized from town. Even old Martha Coleman, who had spoken up for them before, was there, riding a sturdy-looking mule. "Josiah Brennan!" the mayor boomed as he reined in his horse. "It's about time you came home!" Martha Coleman slid down from her mule with surprising agility. "I told these folks you were telling the truth," she declared, beaming at them. "I knew your dear Margaret, Josiah. She would be so proud of you for finally standing up for what's right." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. These weren't hired guns. They were neighbors. They were friends. People who remembered Josiah not as a vagrant, but as the man he once was. Just then, Drummond and his 2 thugs emerged from the trees on the other side of the creek. They pulled up short, their faces a mask of shock and rage at the sight of the assembled crowd. "What is this?" Drummond snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. "This is a welcoming party, Sheriff," Mayor Henderson said, his voice cold, "for the rightful owner of this land." "This land is evidence in a territorial dispute," Drummond shouted, trying to regain control. "You are all interfering with an official investigation." A grizzled miner with a huge beard stepped forward, spitting a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt near Drummond's horse. "The only investigating that needs doing, Drummond, is into how you got the deed to my father's claim after he died. You told my mother it was worthless." Another rancher spoke up. "And you told me the land office had seized my grazing rights for back taxes. Then you sold those same rights to Patterson's company a week later." One by one, the people in the crowd began to speak. A dam of fear that had held for years had finally broken. They told stories of stolen claims, forged documents, and threats made in the dead of night. It was a flood of accusations, washing away the foundation of lies Drummond had built his power on. Drummond's face went from red to a pasty white. He was surrounded. There was no escape. "This is mob justice!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I am the law!" "Not anymore, you're not," a calm voice said. 2 men pushed their way through the crowd. The U.S. Marshals. They had ridden with the townsfolk, silent and watchful. One of them held up a thick warrant. "Sheriff Jedediah Drummond," the marshal said, his voice flat and final. You are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, land theft, and on suspicion of accessory to the murder of Silas Croft 30 years ago." Drummond looked like he had been punched in the gut. He stared at Josiah, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred. This was all his fault. The old ghost had come back from the grave to ruin him. As the marshals cuffed him and his stunned deputies, Clara watched Josiah's face. The weight of 3 decades seemed to lift from his shoulders. He stood tall, breathing in the mountain air as if for the first time. The wandering was finally over. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, the crowd began to disperse, leaving Clara and Josiah in the quiet company of Mayor Henderson and a few old friends. "The territorial governor wants to see you next week, Josiah," the mayor said. "There's talk of officially making this whole region a new county. It'll need organizing. It'll need a leader. Someone people trust." Josiah looked at the golden nugget still clutched in Clara's hand. Then he looked at the faces of the people around him. He finally understood. The gold wasn't the treasure. The land wasn't the treasure. The people were, their trust, their community. That was the real wealth of Wyoming. He turned to Clara, his gray eyes soft. The gentle tone she had come to love was back in his voice. "What do you say, Clara?" he asked. "Are you ready to help an old man build something that will last?" She looked at the faces watching them, faces filled with acceptance and respect. This was it. The thing she'd been searching for her whole life. Not a husband in California, not a lie to hide behind. A home, a family, a place where she belonged. She smiled, the first truly joyful smile of her life. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, Papa. Let's build something together." The choice she made at that train station, the simple act of kindness to a stranger, hadn't just saved one man's life. It had saved a whole community, uncovered decades of corruption, and forged a new future out of the ashes of the past. Her journey hadn't ended when she missed that train. It had just begun. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the Old West.